The story of St. John de Brito begins against a backdrop marked by the splendor and tensions of 17th century Europe, when Portugal was still living the echoes of the great navigations and maintained strong ties with its colonies scattered across the world. Within a noble family connected to the very Portuguese court, John was born, destined from an early age to live amid human grandeur and political influences that shaped the course of the nation. Yet contrary to what many imagined for a young man of aristocratic lineage, his heart did not incline toward ambitions of power, but toward the silent and profound search for God. From childhood, John displayed an uncommon spiritual sensitivity, an inclination toward prayer, and a sincere desire to understand the mysteries of the Catholic faith that illuminated his family's life. This inner mark, almost like a divine seal, would accompany him throughout his life, guiding him along paths that completely defied the social expectations of his time. Still very young, John faced a striking episode that would incontestably shape his view of life and mission. Gravely ill, when everyone feared for his survival, his mother, moved by faith and trust in God, consecrated the boy to Christ, pleading for his healing and promising to dedicate him to the Lord's service if he was spared. The miracle happened. John recovered in a surprising way, and this divine intervention became a spiritual landmark, not only for his mother, but for the whole family. From that moment on, many began to see in the young man's life a sign of divine favor, as if God had preserved him for a great and mysterious purpose that would only be revealed with time. This episode also rooted in John's heart a deep gratitude and the conviction that his life belonged entirely to the Lord. John de Brito's childhood, though lived amid the luxury of the court, was permeated by small renunciations that expressed his early spiritual maturity. While other children delighted in festivities, noisy games, and displays of power, John preferred moments of silence, reading, and contemplation. It was common to see him withdrawn from the excesses of the nobility, seeking in the quieter corners of palaces a place to pray or to reflect on the stories of the saints, which so captivated him. This natural inclination toward interiority awakened admiration and, at the same time, strangeness among those who saw in him an uncommon vocation. For John, however, faith was not a social ornament, but the vital center of his existence. As he grew, John drew closer to important figures in Portuguese spirituality, including Jesuits who were involved in the formation of the nobility. The Society of Jesus, founded by Saint Ignatius of Loyola, exerted great influence in education, and it was through its pedagogical and spiritual methods that John found a clearer path to his vocation. The spiritual exercises, with their depth and interior demands, profoundly affected the young man, awakening in him an ardent desire to devote himself to evangelization and to the proclamation of the Catholic faith. Even surrounded by possibilities for a political or military career, as was expected for someone of his position, John felt within himself a call that echoed more strongly than any future that looked brilliant in the eyes of the world. When he decided to enter the Society of Jesus, John faced resistance from many around him, especially because his decision ran contrary to the social expectations of the nobility. For some, it was inconceivable that a young man with such prestige would dedicate himself to missionary life, marked by sacrifices, renunciations, and constant dangers. Yet John's heart was already firmly set on Christ, and no human opposition could restrain the impulse the Holy Spirit had placed within him. His entrance into the society was not motivated by superficial impulses, but by a solid inner conviction, deeply matured through years of prayer and discernment. Thus, John de Brito officially began his path toward holiness. During his formation as a Jesuit, John stood out for his intelligence, discipline, and ability to adapt to adversity. It was evident that his vocation was not limited to intellectual life, but was deeply rooted in the desire to announce Christ to those who did not know him. He studied philosophy, theology, and the missionary arts, preparing rigorously to take the gospel beyond the borders of Portugal. His heart burned with the desire to be sent to the distant lands of the East, where many missionaries were already pouring out their sweat and their blood for the spread of the faith. For John, the mission was not merely an activity, but an existential calling, to give himself entirely, like Christ, for the salvation of souls. Living alongside other Jesuits also shaped his spirituality, helping him understand that the mission requires far more than initial enthusiasm. John learned that evangelization demands patience, humility, a deep knowledge of local cultures, and a life of intense prayer to sustain every step taken in foreign lands. His preparation included not only study, but the constant practice of renunciation, discipline, and obedience, pillars of Jesuit life. At the same time, he developed an extraordinary sensitivity for dialogue with different religious traditions, something that would be essential in his future mission in India. The specific call to India matured within him like a divine inspiration, almost like an irresistible impetus that moved him beyond the boundaries of human logic. While many feared the risks of such a distant mission, John saw in it the opportunity to fulfill his vocation completely, dedicating himself to proclaiming the gospel in a land complex and rich in religious traditions, and marked by profound social challenges. Every piece of news he received about the missions in the East inflamed his heart even more, making him understand that God was calling him beyond the security of Europe. The decision to depart was not the fruit of impulse, but of a spiritual maturation that led him to the certainty that his life would only be complete if placed entirely at the service of those most in need of faith. Before leaving, John lived intense moments of interior preparation, seeking to strengthen his soul for all that he would face. The farewell to his family was marked by tears and by the certainty that this path would be irreversible. Even in the face of the suffering of those he loved, John remained firm, sustained by the conviction that God was calling him to a mission greater than his own human affections. Renouncing the comforts of nobility and the life he could have led was one of the first great sacrifices he offered to Christ, preparing himself for many others that would follow. Thus, when he set sail for India, John de Brito carried with him not only books and the simple clothing of a missionary, but a heart wholly surrendered to God and willing to face any obstacle for the sake of the gospel. His departure marked the beginning of one of the most extraordinary missionary stories in the Catholic Church, in which faith, courage, and love for souls joined to transform not only John's life, but that of thousands who would encounter Christ through him. The young Portuguese nobleman became at that moment a pilgrim of God and an apostle of distant lands, beginning a journey that would culminate in martyrdom and eternal glory. When St. John de Brito arrived in India, he encountered a world completely different from anything he had known in Portugal. The vibrant colors, the multiple languages, the deeply rooted customs, and the cultural complexity of the subcontinent impressed him profoundly. He quickly realized in the very first days that it would be impossible to evangelize without first understanding that rich human tapestry, which blended ancient traditions, diverse beliefs, and rigid social systems, such as the caste system. Instead of looking upon that setting with strangeness or superiority, John allowed himself to be moved by respect and a willingness to learn. His first goal was not to preach, but to listen, to observe, and to immerse himself in the local culture, convinced that the gospel only flourishes when the missionary approaches people with true humility. His initial contact with local communities revealed not only linguistic challenges, but deep social barriers that prevented any superficial approach. The caste structure was so rigid that it prevented people from different social groups from even touching objects in common or eating in the same place. John soon realized that he could not simply import a European model of evangelization into that reality, for that would not only be ineffective, but could cause even greater conflicts. Thus he decided to follow the example of Saint Francis Xavier, another great Jesuit missionary who had passed through the region decades earlier and began to adapt his presence to local customs. This movement required spiritual courage and cultural detachment, but it quickly bore surprising fruit. To communicate effectively with local peoples, John dedicated himself intensely to the study of languages, especially Tamil, which was widely spoken in the region where he would serve. Learning it was not easy, for it was an entirely different language from those known in the West, with unique structure, phonetics, and vocabulary. Yet John showed impressive perseverance, studying for hours on end, writing, repeating, and conversing with the inhabitants until he became able to preach, counsel, and dialogue with fluency. This effort opened doors that would never open for a missionary who remained bound to Latin or Portuguese, showing that his desire to evangelize was sustained by a radical surrender to God's will. At the same time, John understood that he needed to go beyond language and also immerse himself in local customs. Thus, he chose to adopt the typical clothing of the sannyasis, holy men who renounced material goods and lived in intense spiritual austerity. This decision made a great impact among the inhabitants, for foreigners rarely showed such respect for their traditions. By dressing as an ascetic, John did not seek to deceive anyone, but to facilitate closeness with the poorest and most marginalized, especially those who lived under the weight of the social oppression of the lowest castes. The gospel he proclaimed found an echo in people who, for the first time, felt seen, welcomed, and loved by God. Even as he adapted to the culture, John did not relinquish absolute fidelity to the gospel and to Catholic doctrine. He knew that evangelization did not consist in mixing beliefs or diluting the faith, but in presenting Christ with clarity and love, in a way accessible to the local reality. Therefore, while he learned Indian customs, he also interpreted them in the light of Christian faith, separating what could be embraced from elements incompatible with Christ's teaching. His capacity for discernment was admirable and revealed his profound Jesuit formation, founded on prudence, prayer, and the constant search for the divine will. Thus, John became a true pontiff in the original sense of the word, one who builds bridges between cultures without betraying the truth of the gospel. The first conversions began to appear not through the force of grand speeches, but through the silent witness of his dedicated and simple life. People saw in John a man who did not seek power, riches, or glory, but who gave himself entirely to the poor, the sick, and the excluded. His compassionate gaze, his patience amid differences, and his willingness to walk long distances under scorching sun to visit remote villages won the hearts of many. Where no one went, John went. Where the lowest castes were despised, he knelt to care for the wounds of the sick. And through this living witness, Christ became present among them. One of the great challenges John faced in the early years was resistance not only from local religious leaders, but also from political authorities who saw the presence of missionaries as a threat to the traditional social structure. Some groups feared that the spread of Christianity would lead to the breaking of the caste system and to the destabilization of economic and cultural relationships. This opposition produced persecutions, expulsions, and even attempts to silence the missionary. Yet John was not intimidated. His courage came from Christ, and he was willing to face every obstacle to proclaim the truth with charity and firmness, never resorting to violence or imposition. At the same time, tensions arose between certain Portuguese colonizers and the Jesuit mission itself, for many Europeans living in India expected John to adopt behaviors typical of the nobility, keeping himself distant from local peoples. To see a Portuguese nobleman, bearing the title of Fidalgo, living as an Indian ascetic was a scandal to various European officials, who did not understand his decision to abandon privileges. John, however, was not swayed by such criticism. He knew his mission was not to please men but God, and that only a radical surrender in love for local peoples could produce lasting spiritual fruits. This posture further reinforced the authenticity of his witness. Little by little, John began to realize that his mission in India would not be marked only by external challenges, but also by profound internal spiritual battles. He lived constantly between physical exhaustion, longing for his homeland, linguistic difficulties, and the solitude of being a foreigner amid such a different culture. Yet in every tribulation, he found consolation in prayer, especially in meditating on Christ's passion, which reminded him that every missionary must be willing to carry his cross. His intimate relationship with Christ was strengthened precisely in moments of greatest trial, transforming his human frailty into a source of grace for many. Thus, the first years of St. John de Brito's mission in India were marked by a combination of intense difficulties, deep cultural adaptations, and surprising spiritual fruits. He not only learned to live alongside a people completely different from himself, but also became part of them, living as a true brother among the poorest and most humiliated. With his courage, humility, and burning love for the gospel, John prepared the ground for even greater works that would forever mark the history of evangelization in the East. As St. John de Brito deepened his missionary presence among the peoples of southern India, reports began to emerge of graces and extraordinary events that deeply touched people's hearts. Though he never sought recognition or personal glory, his life of intense prayer and absolute surrender to God's will drew a kind of supernatural light that manifested concretely in daily life. One of the most notable aspects was the peace he radiated even in the face of the greatest challenges. Many who met him testified to feeling a divine presence in his words, as if Christ spoke through him. These interior signs, together with the constant care he dedicated to the sick and the poor, awakened in communities the perception that John was not merely a wise man or a foreign ascetic, but a man profoundly united to God. Among the most impressive events recorded in the mission were physical and spiritual healings that occurred through his ministry. They were not spectacles or public demonstrations of power, but simple gestures permeated by prayer. John often laid hands on the sick, anointed them with devotion, and prayed with deep fervor, trusting entirely in divine action. Various accounts state that people who had carried illnesses for years found relief after his supplications, and others who lived tormented by spiritual oppression experienced liberation. These facts not only impressed local communities, but also stirred great curiosity among those who, until then, had distrusted the Christian faith. For John, however, every miracle was only a sign of God's mercy, never a reason for self-glory. The growth of the mission was also nourished by the silent witness of moral and spiritual transformation that arose among the newly converted. When someone embraced Christianity, it was not for human advantage, but through a profound experience of encountering Christ through the missionary. Many abandoned cultural practices that violated human dignity, such as certain forms of ritual violence or social exclusion, as they learned to live according to the Gospel's teachings. John accompanied each person with immense patience, explaining the truths of the faith in a simple and compassionate way. He had the gift of adapting his language to the local context without losing depth, allowing even the most humble to grasp the beauty of the Christian message. One of the most notable fruits of his mission was the conversion of members of the higher castes, something extremely rare and delicate. John understood that to reach hearts shaped over generations by rigid social systems, it was necessary to present Christianity not as a destructive rupture, but as the fulfillment of the spiritual search that many Hindus sincerely longed for. When a nobleman or local leader showed interest in the gospel, John devoted special care to him, knowing that his conversion could provoke great social tensions. Even so, These men and women found in the missionary's life a witness so authentic and humble that they could not ignore the truth set before them. Many of these conversions became spiritual landmarks for the entire region. Among the most prominent converts was a prince belonging to one of the highest castes. The depth of his conversion impressed not only Christians, but the whole local society, for a man of his status would hardly renounce the cultural and religious privileges inherited over centuries. Through this episode, John de Brito's fame spread even further, provoking both admiration and suspicion. For John, however, every soul that embraced Christianity was a victory of God's love, and he devoted himself to instructing the new faithful with paternal affection, preparing them to face the inevitable persecutions that would arise. The expansion of the mission led John to travel through ever more distant regions, many of them ravaged by extreme poverty and the absence of any religious or social support. He walked kilometers under intense sun, crossed dangerous forests, and faced wild animals, all to reach villages invisible to the eyes of local political power. In each new community, he began by visiting the sick, speaking with elders, and offering small instructions in the faith. His simple and affectionate presence opened doors that no decree or European authority could open. Little by little, entire villages came to see in the missionary a sign of God's love, someone who came not to exploit or dominate, but to serve and to elevate the dignity of all. Another striking characteristic of his apostolate was the founding of small Christian communities organized around prayer, mutual care, and the reading of God's word. John knew that true evangelization did not depend only on the missionary, but on the formation of local leaders capable of sustaining the faith in times of absence or persecution. Therefore, he devoted time to the formation of indigenous catechists who became pillars of the mission. These men and women, deeply touched by John's witness, courageously assumed the responsibility of passing on the faith to future generations, even knowing they could suffer severe reprisals. However, the growth of the mission did not go unnoticed by opponents. Hindu religious leaders and local rulers began to fear that Christian influence would become excessive and threaten the traditional social order. The conversion of members of higher castes was seen as a sign that Christianity could break deeply rooted structures. At the same time, those who abandoned ancestral religious practices were accused of betraying the cultural heritage of their forebears. As a result, John faced direct threats, temporary imprisonments, and expulsions from entire regions. Yet his courage and serenity did not waver, for he knew that every true missionary must face the cross before attaining any lasting fruit. During these periods of persecution, John discovered even more deeply the strength of prayer and trust in divine providence. On many occasions, he took refuge in caves or in dense forests, praying at length to discern the next steps of the mission. Forced solitude never drove him away from God. On the contrary, it drew him closer to Christ's cross. These moments of spiritual desert were, for him, a source of interior renewal, enabling him to return with even greater ardor to the service of the poor. Thus, every persecution became an opportunity for greater surrender and purification. The miracles, conversions, and profound spiritual transformation of communities made the mission of St. John de Brito one of the most extraordinary chapters in the history of evangelization in the East. His work was not limited to preaching, but reached the roots of culture, social structures, and individual consciences. He planted seeds that would continue to grow even after his death, sustained by the fidelity of the Christians he had formed with such love. His presence, though humble, traced a luminous path in southern India, preparing the scene for the dramatic and spiritually grand events that would mark the years to come. As the mission of St. John de Brito expanded, so too did the tension between the Jesuit missionary and those who, for political, social, and religious reasons, felt threatened by the presence of Christianity. His work among the lowest castes was viewed with deep suspicion by local leaders who feared losing influence over the people. But what truly awakened intense hostility was the conversion of members of the higher castes, for this was considered a drastic break with ancient traditions. Many kings and tribal chiefs saw John as a destabilizing agent, capable of altering the delicate balance that sustained their structures of power. The missionaries' growing popularity, far from being a cause for celebration, became a direct threat that needed to be controlled. John de Brito's first arrests happened suddenly and violently in response to pressure from Hindu religious leaders who accused him of disturbing the social order. On one occasion, John was dragged through the streets before a crowd that, incited by authorities, began to harass him with shouts, stones, and insults. Even so, his serenity did not falter. He accepted every humiliation as part of his conformity to Christ crucified. The guards who arrested him expected to find fear or anger, but what they saw was a disconcerting calm that only increased the curiosity of some and the hatred of others. John seemed to understand from the beginning that his mission would only be complete if sealed with suffering, just as he had promised Christ since his youth. Despite imprisonments and tortures, John never ceased to show love for his persecutors. His deeply Christian posture disarmed even some of the soldiers assigned to guard him. Instead of condemning them, he sought to speak with them, to teach them the truth of the faith, and to show that his presence in India had no other purpose than to lead souls to God. This attitude produced an inner division among those who held him. Some despised him even more, irritated by his unshakable serenity, while others were touched by his kindness and ended up helping him discreetly. John lived every moment of imprisonment as an occasion for evangelization, for he knew that Christ transforms suffering into an instrument of salvation. In one of the most striking imprisonments of his missionary life, John was subjected to severe whippings and had his garments torn off before the crowd. His weakened body bore the marks of violent blows meant not only to wound, but to humiliate. Yet even in this state of extreme pain, he lifted his eyes to heaven and prayed. This scene, witnessed by various faithful and curious onlookers, became one of the most impressive episodes in the history of his mission. Many testified that John seemed to radiate a kind of inner light, as if his soul were more alive than ever, even as his body was brutally punished. For those who watched that spectacle of cruelty, the figure of the missionary became a silent testimony to the invincible strength of Christian faith. After successive arrests and expulsions, authorities of the local kingdom decided to send him out of their lands, believing that his absence would dissipate the Christian movement growing among the population. Thus, John was handed over to Portuguese officials, who took him back to Goa and later to Portugal. The return journey was marked by uncertainty and physical suffering, for his body, weakened by torture, began to show signs of permanent wear. Yet the greatest pain he carried was not physical, but spiritual, the sorrow of leaving behind the communities he loved so much. For John, returning to Europe was a necessary obedience, but his heart remained in India, among those to whom he had promised to dedicate his life. When he arrived in Portugal, John was received with admiration by many who knew his story and recognized his exemplary courage. His ascetic figure, marked by missionary privations, contrasted with the pomp of European courts. Those who expected to find pride or triumphalism were surprised to see a humble, silent man profoundly surrendered to God's will. The Portuguese court treated him as a national hero, but John rejected any kind of human glory. In private conversations, he expressed an ardent desire to return to India as quickly as possible, for he felt called by God to pour out his entire life on that soil that had become his true spiritual homeland. During this period in Portugal, John devoted himself to prayer, catechesis, and bearing witness to the missionary reality in the East, encouraging young men to join the Society of Jesus and embrace the missionary vocation. His presence awakened admiration, but also spiritual inquietude, for many perceived in him an authentic holiness that called them to conversion. John spoke not only of the mission's victories, but also of its difficulties, persecutions, and the suffering of Indian Christians, especially those belonging to the poorest castes. He denounced with firmness the abuses committed by European colonizers, who often disrespected the dignity of local peoples, and presented himself as an untiring defender of the most vulnerable, exactly as Christ had taught him. Though he lived amid applause and honors, John sank ever more deeply into the conviction that his mission was not yet finished. The inner call to return to India became irresistible, almost like a divine voice resounding in the depths of his soul. He knew his absence placed at risk the Christian communities he had formed, and he feared that without his presence, many would return to former traditions under pressure from hostile authorities. At the same time, John intuited that his return to the East could definitively seal his destiny with martyrdom, but this did not frighten him. On the contrary, he saw in martyrdom the highest expression of love for Christ and for the souls he wished to save. After deep discernment and the authorization of his superiors, John decided to return to India, even knowing that his presence would reignite persecutions. This return was not driven by imprudence, but by radical love, the fruit of constant prayer and total surrender to the divine will. Many tried to dissuade him, saying his life would be placed in immediate danger. But John replied serenely that the missionary does not belong to himself, and that life only finds meaning when offered entirely to God. Thus, with the same ardor of his youth, but now bearing the weight of painful experiences, he departed again for the East, aware that the final pages of his mission would be written in blood. John de Brito's return to India was not the restart of a mission, but the beginning of his path toward martyrdom. He knew it, sensed it, and accepted it with interior peace. His courage and obedience to God's will became even more evident in this period, revealing the depth of his missionary soul. He returned not as a human hero, but as a servant of Christ, willing to give his own life so that the gospel might flourish among those for whom he had fought and suffered so much. Thus began the final and most intense stage of his journey, which would culminate in one of the most beautiful and moving martyrdoms in the history of the Church. When St. John de Brito returned to India to resume his mission, he found a setting even more tense than the one he had left. The Christian communities he had formed resisted with courage, but lived under constant threats from local chiefs who sought to eliminate the influence of Christianity. John quickly realized that his return had not gone unnoticed. Many considered him a direct enemy of religious traditions and the established social order. Yet instead of being intimidated, he felt an even greater ardor in his heart. He understood that God had called him back to that land not to rebuild his missions comfortably, but to offer, as the final seed, the total witness of his life. The intimate awareness of the approaching martyrdom did not frighten him, but strengthened him, like one who sees in the cross the full realization of the divine will. In every village he revisited, John met again old converts who received him with tears of joy and deep reverence. For them, his presence was a sign that God had not abandoned them, despite all the persecutions they faced. Women, the elderly, and children surrounded him, asking for blessings and counsel, and John responded with the same paternal love he had always shown. Yet, alongside spiritual joy, there was also the weight of concern. Many knew that John's return would awaken the wrath of authorities, and feared that their beloved missionary would be arrested again, or worse, killed. Even so, John answered every anxious heart with an impressive serenity, affirming that the Christian must always trust in divine providence, even when God's ways are mysterious and painful. With his return to the mission, John also resumed his life of intense austerity, once again adopting the garments and customs of the sannyasis, living with extreme simplicity and dedicating long hours to prayer. He knew that only a life deeply rooted in God could sustain the spiritual weight of the persecution that approached. In the silent pre-dawn hours, he often withdrew to isolated places, where he spent hours in contemplation before God. There, his prayers became an intimate dialogue with Christ, who seemed to prepare him spiritually for the final sacrifice. Some companions testified that John radiated a supernatural peace, as if he were already living partly in heaven, even while walking amid the sufferings of earth. Miracles and conversions continued to happen with even greater intensity after his return. Many sick people were healed through his intercession, and various families, previously divided by rivalries and cultural customs, found reconciliation through his spiritual guidance. John saw in these events not only God's goodness toward the people, but also a sign that his mission needed to reach its fullness. He often said that God always prepares the spiritual ground before allowing a martyr to shed his blood. For martyrdom is not a human tragedy, but a divine harvest. Therefore, each miracle he witnessed was for him a reason for deep gratitude and also an awareness that his final offering was near. In this period, John once again faced problems related to conversions within higher castes, especially when a local prince decided to abandon traditional practices that included rituals considered incompatible with Christian faith. This decision caused enormous outrage among religious and political leaders in the region, who blamed John directly for encouraging the abandonment of ancestral traditions. The situation became so grave that various groups united to persecute not only the converted prince, but all Christians in his community. John, perceiving the imminent danger, tried to intercede peacefully, but his efforts only increased hostility against him. To his opponents, John had exceeded every limit by influencing men of social prestige. Tension grew when an order was issued for John de Brito's capture. Soldiers began to scour entire regions in search of the missionary, who continued preaching from village to village as if nothing were happening. For him, prolonged flight was not an option. John believed deeply that the missionary must always remain accessible to the people he serves, and that he should not protect his own life at the cost of others' faith. Even knowing that his arrest would almost certainly mean death, he continued visiting the sick, celebrating the sacraments, and comforting persecuted faithful. His fearlessness impressed even those opposed to Christianity, for it showed that his faith was not a theory but a reality lived with heroism. At a certain moment, some Christians tried to hide John in dense forests, but he resisted. He said he had not been called by God to save his life, but to save it by giving it. This radical detachment astonished his faithful, who saw in him a living reflection of the first apostolic missionaries. John explained to them that martyrdom is a gift of God and should never be sought out of pride, but accepted with humility when it presents itself as the mission's inevitable path. His desire was not to die, but to remain faithful to the end, and that fidelity required that he be present where Christians suffered the harshest persecution. When he was finally captured, John showed no resistance whatsoever. Surrounded by soldiers, he greeted them politely and surrendered as one who knows he is only changing stages in his mission. Some of the men sent to arrest him were impressed by his calm and later said they had never seen anyone so willing to face suffering with such serenity. John walked in chains, yet seemed freer than those escorting him. His trust in God turned every step of his imprisonment into an act of surrender and love. During his detention, John was interrogated many times. Authorities wanted him to renounce the Christian faith and abandon the mission among higher castes, promising him freedom if he accepted such conditions. But John responded with unshakable conviction that he could not deny Christ nor prevent the gospel from touching anyone, regardless of social position. His interrogators were perplexed. They could not understand how a man could prefer death to renouncing his missionary work. Yet John remained firm, sustained by an inner strength that transcended any human argument. Thus, amid interrogations, tortures, and long periods of silence in prison, John de Brito understood more and more clearly that his mission was reaching its summit, martyrdom. He accepted this reality with deep interior peace, seeing in it not a failure, but the crowning of everything he had lived. It was the moment to unite himself totally to Christ crucified, offering his life as the supreme testimony of God's love. And though he suffered at the thought of leaving his communities, he felt spiritual joy in realizing that his death would be a fertile seed for future generations. After weeks of imprisonment, interrogations, and tortures, Saint John de Brito was sentenced to death by local authorities. The decision was announced in a dry, almost bureaucratic way, but its effects cut through the air like a cold blade. For political chiefs, his death would be a means of definitively destroying Christian influence in the region. For Hindu religious leaders, it would be a necessary sacrifice to restore what they considered the traditional spiritual order. But for John, the sentence was not an end, but the fulfillment of a promise he had made to God since his youth. Martyrdom, far from terrifying him, awakened in him a supernatural peace. He understood that the missionary is not called to measure human results, but to give himself in love, leaving God to accomplish the work. Thus, he received the sentence as a profound, though painful gift of union with Christ crucified. While awaiting execution, John wrote letters and left counsel for the Christian communities he had formed. His words were imbued with tenderness and spiritual strength. He asked the faithful not to lose heart in the face of persecution, but to remain firm in faith, always remembering that Christianity is strengthened precisely in the most difficult moments. In his letters, John emphasized that his death should not be a reason for sadness, but for hope, for the blood of martyrs has always been the seed of new Christians. The missionary spoke with the serenity of one who already saw, beyond earthly sufferings, the eternal light of heaven drawing near. Many who later read his words testified to sensing in them a fragrance of holiness that surpassed the barriers of time. In his final days, John intensified his life of prayer, offering every pain and humiliation for the conversion of the peoples among whom God had sent him. He saw in martyrdom the supreme form of love, for only one who truly loves is willing to give his own life. His penances, once voluntary, were now imposed by torturers, but John received them with a spirit of sacrifice. Many were astonished to see him pray for his executioners, asking God to grant them light and mercy. This capacity to love even his persecutors demonstrated unmistakably that God's grace was manifested in an extraordinary way in the soul of the Jesuit missionary. On the day of his execution, John was taken from prison and led in chains to the designated place. The walk was long and marked by public humiliations. The crowd, stirred up by rulers, had gathered to witness the missionary's death. Some shouted insults, others threw dust or stones, while soldiers pulled him violently to quicken the pace. Yet amid the agitated multitude, John's face remained serene. His gaze, fixed on the horizon, revealed a spiritual depth that transcended the brutality of the moment. He walked as one who knows that each step is accompanied by Christ, and that soon his soul would be set free to contemplate eternal glory. Upon arriving at the place of execution, John made an unexpected gesture that moved even some of his executioners. He knelt in silence and lifted his eyes to heaven. In his final public prayer, he thanked God for the grace of being called to shed his blood for the salvation of souls. He asked forgiveness for his sins, surrendered his life into the Lord's hands, and prayed that his death would strengthen Christians in the region. His words, though simple, carried an indescribable spiritual weight, Some present later said that at that moment it seemed as though heaven bent down to hear the last breath of its faithful servant. The atmosphere, once noisy, became inexplicably silent, as if even creation recognized the holiness of that instant. The method of execution chosen was cruel and symbolically humiliating. John was tied to a tree in a posture similar to that of condemned men meant to be publicly dishonored. The executioners prepared the ropes with precision, ensuring he could not escape even by moving during the ordeal. Then they began the strangulation, tightening the rope slowly to prolong agony. Even so, John did not cry out, did not renounce the faith, and did not show fear. His lips continued in silent prayer, and his final facial expression, according to witnesses, was one of deep peace, as if he were contemplating something invisible to human eyes. The moment of John de Brito's death was described as one of intense spiritual emotion. When his body finally fell lifeless, many who were present felt a weight in their hearts they could not explain. Some fell to their knees, others wept, and others fled in distress, as if they had taken part in something far greater than they had imagined. There was a palpable sense that John's death was not merely a political or religious act, but a sacred event. His disciples, even at the risk of their lives, approached the site discreetly and gathered whatever they could of his body and clothing, treating them as precious relics. The earth where his blood had been shed became, from that day, a place of deep veneration. After the execution, the Christian communities were seized by grief and fear, but also by renewed spiritual strength. News of John's martyrdom spread quickly throughout the region, causing great emotion among the faithful and even among some who were not yet Christian. Many began to recognize that this missionary, who had given his life without hesitation, was not an ordinary foreigner, but a man deeply united to God. The testimony of his death began to bear fruit almost immediately. Some who had witnessed the martyrdom converted to the Christian faith, while others ceased persecuting the faithful out of fear of acting against someone they considered holy. As the months passed, the martyrdom of John de Brito became a symbol of spiritual resistance and inspiration for missionaries throughout the world. News reached Europe, where it caused enormous impact, especially among Jesuits and among those who had known his story since childhood. In Portugal, his death was received with sorrow, but also with deep honor, for they understood that the young nobleman had become a giant of faith. Rome also received the account of his martyrdom with great reverence, recognizing in him a living example of what it means to surrender oneself totally to the Church's evangelizing mission. With his death, John de Brito definitively united his life to the cross of Christ and gave the world a testimony that would span centuries. His blood became a fertile seed that propelled the Church in the East, strengthening the faithful and inspiring new generations of missionaries. His martyrdom did not extinguish his work. On the contrary, it made it flourish more vigorously than he could ever have imagined in life. The Jesuit missionary, who walked among people so different from his homeland, had now reached the fullness of his mission: to give everything, absolutely everything, for love of God. After the martyrdom of Saint John de Brito, a profound silence took hold of the regions where he had evangelized. It was as though nature, the poor, the sick, the newly converted, and even some adversaries perceived that something immeasurable had happened. The death of a righteous man, especially of a missionary who sheds his blood for Christ, is never an isolated event. It carries a spiritual force that transforms hearts, awakens consciences, and plants seeds that bloom far beyond human time. Christian communities began to gather secretly to remember his words, reread his letters, and repeat with deep reverence his prayers. Every gesture, every counsel, and every sacrifice of John became living teachings, handed down from generation to generation as precious treasures. The impact of the martyrdom was so great that various accounts point to sudden conversions, especially among those who had witnessed the execution. Some soldiers who had taken part in the missionary's death abandoned their former practices and sought out Christians to learn more about the faith John had professed to his final breath. Even among Hindu priests and local chiefs, there arose a spiritual unease difficult to explain, as if John's figure, serene before death, firm in faith, unshaken by torture, remained alive in their memories, silently questioning their values and beliefs. The missionary's death did not silence his voice. Rather, it made it resound with even greater force. As time passed, reports of miracles attributed to John de Brito's intercession began to arise in various villages. People who had kept fragments of his clothing, pieces of the tree where he had been executed, or small objects he used in his mission began to testify to physical and spiritual healings. The sick were restored, families found peace, and old conflicts were resolved after fervent invocations of the martyred missionary. The fame of these graces spread quickly, leading many faithful to venerate John as a saint even before any official recognition by the Church. Popular devotion, moved by gratitude and sincere faith, became a river no persecution could contain. Meanwhile, in Portugal and in Rome, John de Brito's story began to be studied more deeply. His letters, missionary reports, and testimonies from those who had lived with him revealed an extraordinary soul marked by radical humility, heroic courage, and unconditional love for the poorest and most despised. His life was seen as a perfect synthesis of the missionary spirit of the Society of Jesus, which sought to imitate Christ to the last consequences. As the investigation progressed, it became increasingly evident that John had not been merely a talented missionary, but a true saint, shaped by divine grace from childhood and tested by the fire of persecution. The beatification process began with enthusiasm, driven by the growing number of testimonies of graces and by the profound admiration his story awakened among the faithful. In examining his life, the Church found in John a luminous example of total surrender to the evangelizing mission, of defense of human dignity, and of absolute fidelity to the divine will. His ability to adapt to the local culture without compromising the truth of the gospel was considered an exemplary missionary virtue, worthy of imitation by all who wish to proclaim Christ in new contexts. Each stage of the process confirmed ever more clearly that John had lived and died as a true martyr of the Catholic faith. When he was finally proclaimed a saint by the Church, his canonization was not merely a liturgical event, but a universal celebration of his life and mission. In Portugal, his name began to be spoken with deep spiritual pride, as an example of purity, courage, and love for distant peoples. In India, especially in the south of the country, canonization rekindled a devotion that had never disappeared, strengthening even more the communities he had founded. The image of John de Brito became a symbol of spiritual resistance and hope for all persecuted Christians who found in him not only an intercessor in heaven, but a brother who knew deeply the weight of the cross. The legacy of Saint John de Brito, however, goes far beyond miracles and canonization. He left the world the certainty that true evangelization only flourishes when the missionary gives himself completely to the life of those he wishes to serve. His method, based on humility, cultural adaptation, charity, and absolute fidelity to the gospel, remains current and necessary in every age. John taught that mission is not territorial conquest or religious imposition, but encounter, listening, dialogue, and service. His testimony remains a beacon for all who wish to proclaim Christ in diverse, multicultural societies that are sometimes hostile to the Christian faith. In contemplating his life, it becomes clear that John de Brito was, above all, a man moved by love. Love for God, love for the poor, love for the mission, love for the truth. His martyrdom was not defeat, but a spiritual triumph that echoes to this day in the Church. He did not live for himself, and that is why his life remains alive. every community that preserves his memory, every faithful person who prays before his image, every missionary who finds inspiration in his story carries within them a piece of the missionary flame John kindled in southern India, a flame that will never be extinguished. Thus, the script about St. John de Brito concludes with the certainty that his life remains one of the most beautiful pages in the history of the Catholic Church. He reminds us that faith, when lived radically, becomes a light capable of crossing centuries, cultures, and continents. John de Brito was noble by birth, but he became a king in heaven through his total surrender to the evangelizing mission. His life is invitation, provocation, inspiration, and his martyrdom, celebrated by the whole Church, continues to be a powerful testimony of love that conquers hatred, hope that conquers fear, and the eternal glory reserved for those who give everything for Christ.